All right, it is 10 a.m. on the dot, so let's get started. Welcome. I want to wish everyone a very pleasant good morning wherever you may be. I'm Julie Arthur. I'm the CASH chair, and I'm the executive director at Palm Springs Unified School District. And on screen with me this morning, I have Jeff Becker, CASH vice chair, and with the Office of Fresno County Superintendent of Schools. As you know, CASH has been providing you with weekly webinars to ensure we serve our members with the latest and best information to help school districts, county offices of education, our consultants and vendors that work with us as we look to the return of students and teachers to our schools in August, September, whatever form that may take. Ours seems to evolve weekly. So last week's CASH webinar was the risks and liabilities anticipated in opening school. And for a recording with questions and answers asked during this webinar, please go visit our CASH website. Click on the COVID-19 link to see this info and other links of past webinars also. So today's webinar is FEMA disaster funding, counting every dollar. So we'll look at opportunities and advice on seeking disaster assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the level of scrutiny that FEMA audits are going to require and how to start preparing now. So Jeff, how you doing? How's things going in Fresno County this week?
Well, we're doing all right. We're hanging in there. As we mentioned last week, you know, our friends at CDE released their Stronger Together document. Mine's already starting to get a little bit tattered. So this past week's been a lot of looking at that document and working through that. You've got yours there too. Fantastic.
You actually printed and bound it.
Nice.
The print.
So we've been spending a lot of time with that, reconciling that to our plans that we had already started, as well as working through the recommendations in that document with our local health department and making sure that we're staying in sync there. So this topic has been, this information has been the topic of much discussion amongst our school districts. So while we're doing that, PPE is still a huge topic. And, you know, I mentioned last week as well that OES is sending county offices some PPE for our school districts, but we know that we're going to need additional items and have to take additional measures in our schools and buildings to keep them safe. So we have been doing a lot of talking about, hey, how do we make sure we can access FEMA funding and working with our finance office on that. And I tell you what, I'm finding that's a challenge in needing to move as fast as we're moving right now, but still keeping good records. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Obviously a very busy time. How about you in Palm Springs?
We are doing okay. Actually, I was just thinking, I was a little excited about the FEMA funding, and I'm thinking, I can't wait to get started on a spreadsheet somewhere. So it's one of those. It being able to plan and get all that set up actually helps de-stress you. And I think the conversation now that we're going to have today is a great way to help de-stress everyone knowing what's going to be expected. So yeah, same here. It is one of those that you kind of think about, what am I missing? What do I need? So hearing from some of us that have, you know, gone through those issues is going to really, I think, be helpful to everyone out there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, why don't I cover a little bit of housekeeping and then we'll jump into the presentations. So first of all, thank you for joining us. You are muted if you're an attendee, but we do want to hear your questions, so you can use the chat box feature. Just beware that as you're messaging, make sure you select all panelists and attendees by using the drop-down caret in the chat box feature. That will be monitored by folks, and people will jump in and ask questions throughout the workshop to make sure that your questions are answered. And as Julie mentioned, we are recording the webinar today, so it will be made available to CASH members for future reference. And our panelists today, I'm excited that we have Fred Yeager and Jennifer Schwinn, both from the California Department of Education. Also Lois Copeland and Jim Smith from Vanner Construction Management, Letty Boggs from Colby, and Addison Covert from Parker and Covert LLP. So we saved an attorney to wrap us up today. So I believe that Fred and Jennifer, you are up first. So Fred, why don't you come on onto the screen with us here and share with us your insights on the various agencies and tools available to schools. I know CDE has done a lot of work in this in the past, and now we have another type of disaster that we're dealing with. So we're welcome, Fred and Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for everyone joining in. I am Fred Yeager with the Department of Education. And with me, maybe some of you have already met Jennifer. She's been with us since February, so 4 or 5 months. Most of that time she has been with us distantly, so it's a lot of Zoom time with Jennifer. But she is a former superintendent who has been through FEMA on the ground in the district, so she has a lot of perspectives on that, and she'll carry most of our discussion today. What I want to do is just give some background as to CDE'S. There we go. I was counting on my calendar, and I think we're approaching about 100 days in quarantine. I have a little hash mark on my wall for every day. So when this started, Superintendent Thurman's message to schools and districts was that school is open. It's just the campuses are closed. So with that approach, we understood that this was new for all of us, for the department, for districts, for the students. We all had to learn how to work remotely, teach remotely. Students had to learn how to be a kindergartner remotely. So very new. And that it was important that the CDE, along with other state agencies, listen to the districts as to what they needed to get to where they needed to go to ensure that students would learn. There was not learning loss. Students and staff were safe. Because without safety of everyone, learning really isn't going to happen. So with that framework, wanted to highlight a lot of the efforts that the department undertook during that time. And this is during the closure period. And this is an excerpt from the Stronger Together document that Jeff and Julie mentioned that talks about the steps the department took to help districts transition to a remote environment. So take a look at those as you in your document, your Strong Together document. Probably a little easier to read, but did want to, with cooperation of the mouse, highlight some of the key activities we did. There we go. So as districts moved to remote learning, we provided 15 online training sessions. And those are still on the YouTube address down there. Some of them are how to do remote learning, teaching curriculum, how to provide food service. That's something that a lot of us still see as we drive around town, the lines at the schools passing out food. And it's always amazing how that happened so quickly, that the schools were out on the bus loading zone with trays of food within days of this. Fiscal, how do you track your expenses? What is the state looking at for additional resources, whether it was AB 117 or the Federal CARES Act? And special education, a lot of effort went into the special education of how to meet the individual plan of students in sometimes a virtual and remote setting. So take a look at those videos, always relevant. We also formed 5 task forces to look into closing the digital divide. And the digital divide is probably not a new thing. It's maybe perhaps enhanced by COVID, as more people have to remote teach. And there are areas where digital capacity is a concern. And now it is more directly impacting upon the equity of education that students are receiving. So how do we deal with learning loss, like Jennifer's high school seniors? How about supplies, cleaning supplies, PPEs, the achievement gap? So again, take a look at those on our YouTube station. We also have on our webpage, and you see the address there, number of resources to address these areas such as mental health. I know You know, my mental health has been impacted during this time of being quarantined and isolated. Resources on how to provide school meals, special education. So there's a lot of information there that is still going to be relevant as we transition to partial school days on campus, some hybrid, some all virtual. So keep those resources in mind as you continue on to the reentry planning. Right. Stronger Together. So as mentioned, this came out June 8th. And it was put together with a task force of stakeholders, of associations, teachers, educators, parents, and provides guidance in these 5 areas. Now, these are guidance because we know that there are 1,000 districts in the state with various capacities and needs, and that the CDE has always approached it of providing information and guidance for districts to make their own unique and community context-informed decisions. So nothing in this guidance is a mandate, is required, is information to hopefully spur thought and conversation within the district and its community as to how best approach reentry into school in August or September. So within each section, oops, no, that was fine, that was fine. Within each section, you'll find information on the background. What are the essential questions for planning? So in virtual learning, maybe an essential question is, do students have a device? Do they have access to the internet, right? There are best practices. So here's how some of your colleagues and neighboring districts may have approached this. They may be a good peer resource to understand how a district resolved a local concern, right? And then there's various resources throughout the document, whether it's link into the CDE page or information on technology and digital curriculum. So those are all there. And again, this guide is for planning discussions at your district, and it's and CDE is interested in hearing any issues that come up across these issues, so that we can kind of get a sense of what's going on statewide, and if there's areas we need to address in future guidance or seek some support in legislatively. So keep us posted of things that you think maybe you need some help in, some assistance, some guidance. You know, send us a note. So to the next slide, please. So as I introduced Jennifer, and she's been the principal author of School Planning Guidance, a document we are preparing to complement and build upon the Stronger Together guidance, Stronger Together document of Superintendent Thurman. And this will provide some more practical, hands-on type activities for planning how to reentry school, such as what is your anticipated enrollment? Many districts are doing surveying to find out how many kids are coming back. And what is your program? Are you offering a 100% virtual option, a hybrid option? So with that understanding of your enrollment and the type of program, you get that sense of how much of facilities do I need? Do I need all the space in my district or partial? How do I do social distancing? Does that mean I have to use twice as many classrooms? So, and within all that context is your budget. So understanding that if you open, how much space you open and use for in-place instruction does require cleaning, and that costs money. How will you get those resources? So that's the sort of guidance we're working on, and Jennifer's been our main author on that. So that's a good transition point. And again, Jennifer joins us after many years as an educator at all levels, a superintendent in school districts, has been through the FEMA process with some of the fires in Northern California in the last year, so is very familiar with the process, probably very familiar in how a district goes about making sure they're, like Jeff, understanding how to do things both quickly and correctly. So with that, Jennifer, if you want to take it from here.
Thank you, Fred. All right, can you take us to the next slide, please? All right, hi everyone, I'm Jennifer Schwinn, and I want to talk to you about some of the support that has already gone to the LEAs and also what is on its way now. So with the CARES Act, funding was set aside for supplies for schools. That funding was sent directly to the LEA, so they already received that, and they had freedom to use that money as they needed, whether for cleaning or for distance learning, whatever was needed as we quickly shifted during the pandemic. And now the Cal OES, the California Office of Emergency Services, is currently delivering supplies to all county offices in California to distribute supplies that the schools, districts, charter schools, and after-school programs in their counties will need as they reopen. So there's an allotment for every person that they anticipate in that area, children and employees. So there are masks, cloth and disposable for all persons, face shields for teachers, gloves, thermometers for school sites, and all program sites, and then hand sanitizer and gallons of hand sanitizer for each campus. So that's something that I'm sure will be well received. And the idea is that they're offering a 60-day supply to get everyone started with those basic supplies, and they'll have time to decide what they need to go beyond that. And then after that, districts will be on their own to sort that out themselves. So that might be a time when you're thinking about how FEMA can help you. So if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So now you're thinking, all right, I've used up my extra money from the CARES Act, and I've got these supplies coming, but I think I'm going to need more. So as you're having extra expenses, you want to start keeping records. So FEMA is going to require documentation for any excess expense that you are seeking reimbursement for. So you're going to want to track the costs and any action taken. Take really good records about when, where, and by whom the action was taken. That's what FEMA is going to want to know before they'll reimburse. All right, what will FEMA cover? FEMA will reimburse projects that support life, public health, and safety. So keep that in mind when you're trying to think about what you might be able to put into this pile for your expenses. Now, FEMA will reimburse up to 75% of documented eligible expenses beyond your normal operating expenses. So if you normally provide food for students, then that wouldn't be a FEMA expense. But if you're supplying additional meals or having to supply meals in a way that's now costing additional money, that would be the FEMA expense. That makes sense. Or if you're supplying meals maybe for adults when you weren't doing that before, that would be a FEMA expense, for example. Now, if you used your money from another source, though, to pay for that, then you cannot go to FEMA for the same expense, because FEMA will not duplicate support provided by other agencies. So you want to start with your insurance provider, figure out what your insurance is going to provide, and see what everything else that you have available to you, and then what is not covered by others, then you can seek help from FEMA. Another thing you might want to do is talk with your colleagues, share knowledge. Even in terms of your FEMA project, you could choose to band together with a group of districts together, or a county office could choose to create a project to support some smaller districts who don't have the district office manpower to organize this kind of work themselves, because it will take a concerted effort to manage all the paperwork. A district may consider hiring a service for this, an outside person, or like I said, partnering with a COE or another district, a larger district that has the office staff that could handle it. And then that administrative entity can collect 5% of the FEMA award to cover their management costs. And I would guess that might be welcome to some in this time, and they'd have the ability to take that on. All right, next slide, please. All right, so looking specifically at the COVID-19 pandemic, when this pandemic began, FEMA established a new emergency when this national emergency was declared. So on March 22nd, the emergency incident date occurred. However, the period of eligibility goes back to January 2020 because we started to experience expenses back then as we saw the virus coming. So know that when you're tracking your expenses that you're looking back potentially to January 20th. And then know that the period of eligibility has not yet ended. It's still going on. We're still in this national emergency, so we're still tracking costs now. And that means that there's still time for you to apply for a request for public assistance. So you want to go ahead and do that now. Submit an RPA to FEMA to be established eligible for public assistance. And we've put the link here for you. It'll take you right to where you need to go to do that. All right, and can I take the next slide, please? All right, so what kinds of things might you seek reimbursement for? Remember, it has to be excess costs. So with staffing costs, think about overtime. Now with your salaried staff, you won't be able to ask for overtime. You know, management doesn't earn overtime, but and I'm sure you're putting in a lot of it. However, if you have paid your classified account for your classified workers, for example, on force account work, and you've asked them to do additional work in order to prepare the facility because of the pandemic, then that overtime work, the extra projects that you might put on time and material, or temporary contracts that you might have to have with workers would be eligible. Again, providing emergency food, providing temporary facilities that you need to ensure safe physical distancing. Say you need to secure another facility in order to have the additional physical distancing for your students, and there's a cost to that, that could be eligible for reimbursement. And then supplies like PPE and cleaning materials. All right, and let's move on to the next slide. I think I may have just got to the end.
Jennifer, Tom Duffy here. Can we just go back 1 second?
Yes.
When you talk about temporary facilities, so does that mean if a district is recognizing that it needs more space and it can potentially lease facilities to socially distance more effectively their students and their staff, that would be eligible?
Let's go into that in a little more detail, because there are challenges with leasing space for K-12 students. Remember that any space that you, but yes is the first answer is yes, it could be eligible, but what is going to be appropriate space for students? So, for example, the facilities for putting students in, they have to be Field Act approved. And so you may have seen videos of tents being set up in Norway as they brought elementary students back to school, and they were teaching in tents. We cannot do that. No teaching in tents. You can't put up a whole bunch of tents for students. But you could make an agreement with your local community college, because community college facilities are under the Field Act. And if the community college is going on to more distance learning and they have classrooms that are available, maybe that would allow you to move your high school students into those facilities, and perhaps use your high school facilities then for your middle school, maybe expand your elementary all the way into the middle school, something like that that would allow you to have more students learning at the same time. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Yes, thank you.
Jennifer, this is Julie. One question. If we do that, there's a transportation cost many times. Is that something that would be covered?
I hadn't seen transportation as one of the items is covered. I haven't come across that in the trainings that I've been to. So I don't know. I'm not going to say for sure, but it's not one that comes immediately to mind. We'll have to look deeper to see that. But you're right. Transportation expenses in a lot of this could come in. Let me do some research on that and get back to you on that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions where we are right now? All right, let's see what the next slide is. Okay, so unless you have some more questions for me right now, I'm going to pass it back to my partner, Fred, for the next section.
Jennifer,
yes.
This is Letty. On your previous slide, you had no food, or you had emergency food, and the Cal OES told us that feeding programs themselves are not eligible under FEMA, that the community entity should apply for the feeding program and then reimburse you as the agency providing the service. So I think people need to be really careful with how they're doing feeding program and who is really the entity requesting that food program.
Thank you, Letty, for that clarification. You're right. I just did see that recently, that there are some complications with feeding programs. So right before you dive in, assuming that you'll be able to be reimbursed, look into it. If you have the authority to be that provider. Okay. All right. Any other questions right now? Okay, then I'm going to turn it over to Fred. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Just as, sorry, I had the chat window up and I can't see. So, one of the things that we've talked about in our unit as this goes through is when we're through this re-entry period, and then we have January, and then we have beyond that. What has changed of our understanding of facilities planning in that? Did your district have a facility master plan, and did that help in understanding what is your capacity of schools in this environment, that you had the detailed information in a single point that aided in your planning? Was that an important asset to have? How will you long-term look at virtual instruction? Has it been successful in many areas, and is that something that may influence what your future facility needs may be? Okay. What about the outdoors? Not under a tent or in that, but how can you increase your connectivity with the outdoors? Is that going to influence some of your design of spaces so that there is that greater connectivity? And one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of discussion about is the indoor air quality, particularly the filtering level of MERV. But indoor air quality, as we've seen over the past many years, has been an ongoing topic of thermal comfort and its relation to educational achievement. And now it's taken on this greater ability to filter out potential virus particles. So how is that built into your maintenance plan? Is now that a greater emphasis on higher end materials, greater maintenance, greater facility needs on that. So just some of those things that we've talked about, and I'm sure everybody else has had those conversations in the few down moments you have on that. But and maybe those are things we all explore in the coming months as we start looking a couple years out on things. So and I'm sure there's a lot more. And if you have any ideas or thoughts you've come up with over the time, send them to me, and we'll kind of create a list and share that. So, and I think if the next slide, I think that wraps things up. Just want to highlight that our resources page. Look for this image on our main webpage at cde.ca.gov, and that's the portal to all the resources that I discussed earlier, the YouTube videos, the Stronger Together, a lot of great resources, connectivity to CDC, California Department of Public Health, all right there in one spot. So I think that's it, unless there's any questions or comments or anything to add, Jennifer, out of that?
Well, just looking at the chat, there were two good questions. One was about the portable wash stations, whether those might be reimbursable by FEMA. And that was a good question. I hadn't seen that one discussed before. So I'm going to look into that as well. So I'm going to come back to you with information on the transportation costs and portable wash stations, and give that information to Cash so it can be made available with the resources from this webinar.
There was one more question in the chat box, which was, is there a timeline specific on the PPE supplies to get to school districts?
Well, there's supplies being delivered right now to the county offices, and then the school districts are to go to the county office to arrange for their supplies. And I think it also asked, can we use supplies that we're buying right now for opening in August? Would those be eligible? Yes, those would be eligible, as long as they're not being paid for by your insurance or by the CARES Act, or if it was the donated supplies, right? So it just has to be something that is supplemental, not supplanting.
So Jeff, from the COE perspective, maybe there's some other information as to what you're hearing, maybe in Fresno is another. What is the time frame from these hitting the school sites?
Yeah, as far as the PPE that the Office of Emergency Services is sending, most of my county office colleagues are waiting for the call. The state is using UPS as the logistics company for delivering those. And most of us are also in process of preparing allocation information at the school district level. So we're getting a lump sum for the entire county. So I emailed my local contact just before this webinar, and I'm waiting to hear back on a potential delivery date.
And tying in with Jennifer's comments, that's something to make sure you account that you got X number of masks or whatnot at no cost. So as you do your FEMA and other pieces to have that very granular detail. So
Jeff, I guess a question would be, as county offices, you're then receiving a huge amount of equipment and materials. How are you able to store that? Do you have a lot of extra warehouse space around?
Well, in my instance, it's better to be lucky than good. And I had a warehouse leased that I just emptied out for a construction project to hold the contents of a large building. So I am immediately transitioning that warehouse to PPE. But yeah, county offices are having to find warehouse space and distribute that. I'm expecting in Fresno about 4 semi-trailers full of materials.
Wow. So then that might be something the County Office of Education could actually apply for FEMA reimbursement.
Yes, I'm looking at that warehousing cost as an extra cost in dealing with the pandemic that we otherwise would not have incurred.
Okay. Super. Okay, yeah, I'm not seeing, let's see, is there one other that we've been told stockpiling is not allowed? So there's been much guidance from FEMA, our FEMA rep, that PPEs has to follow a strict cost methodology to determine that stockpiling is not happening?
So I'm guessing that you have to show the rate that the supplies are being used, tracking that. Maybe you want to have a spreadsheet where you're tracking by classroom, by school, something, how much you're going through the supplies in order to show FEMA that you're not stockpiling.
Okay. All right, great. Okay, I think that's it. You know, Jennifer, Fred, thank you again so much. We appreciate that. I'm sure there'll be a few more questions come up along the way, especially if as we keep determining what that opening of school is actually going to look like.
All right, we're here for you.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Next up, we've got FEMA as a vital funding agency and support to public agencies in disaster recovery. We've got Lois and Jim from Banner with us. So Lois and Jim, good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. Doing well. Can you hear me okay?
Great.
Great.
Yes, and same here. Can you hear me as well?
Yes, yes.
Great, great.
So thank you for having us today. Banner Construction Management, headquartered in Sacramento, California, there with you folks. And we do a lot of work throughout the state for various school systems, program, project, and construction management. I'm an area manager and a vice president with Banner. And much of my career has been spent working with school districts around the country. My partner today is an expert in FEMA. She's a 30-year accountant, spent 15 years, the last 15 years of her career focused on federal agencies, grant management, and FEMA. She's been involved with some of the largest disasters in our nation's history and brings a wealth of knowledge. She actually spent 3 years working directly for FEMA as a contractor in Louisiana and Texas. And so she's been spearheading this effort for us at Banner for the past several months and dealing with FEMA directly and gathering information, supporting our clients around the country who are navigating the challenges associated with this disaster, and specifically working with multiple school districts. So I'm going to turn it over to Lois and let her get started. Thank you, folks.
Yes, next slide, please. Jim just went through our introductions, so thank you. So just a basic high-level overview of the FEMA Public Assistance Program, and very, very general as well. And I will expand on a few items that Jennifer just brought up. And following this presentation, I know that Letty and I have discussed some items in her presentation that will expand on what I'm saying here. So these presentations really do complement each other. As you know, the FEMA Public Assistance Program is established by the Robert T. Stafford Act. It's supplemental federal assistance, and everything everybody just said is correct. It's thought of as the funding of last resort. FEMA will reimburse after insurance and any other grant type has paid out. And there's a word missing in this last bullet. It's for both emergency and permanent work. Next slide, please. So in order to comply with receiving FEMA public assistance funding, you have to abide by both the 2 CFR administratively and policy-wise by the 44 CFR, which establishes all of FEMA's guidance. Next slide, please. And luckily, you don't have to memorize all that. FEMA takes both the applications from the 2 CFR and the 44 CFR, and they put it in a policy guide that references everything you need to know. So when you get a moment, go to FEMA.gov and download the policy guide, because it's going to be the basis of every decision that deals with receiving public assistance funding. Next slide, please. So if you're going to participate in the FEMA Public Assistance Program, it's important to know each
entity's responsibility. FEMA is the awarding agency. They will coordinate with state and local agencies. They will establish an office in your town. I'm sure you've met them before. They will collect the project information. They will approve. They will determine eligibility. No one other than FEMA determines final eligibility. They will provide any technical assistance you may need, and they supply the money. As a recipient, the state will educate subrecipients and applicants. They will also collect information, and FEMA gives the money to the state for awarding it to the applicants. So what's your responsibility as an applicant? Well, first you have to request public assistance. You have to identify your damages. You have to abide by FEMA's policy. You have to maintain accurate documentation, and you have to make sure that your project is properly closed out by performing the work, completing it, and maintaining the records. Now the bottleneck here, the reason that arrow is there, because the bottleneck usually comes between the applicant and the subrecipient, making sure that the documentation is complete in order to collect the money from the state. And often that's where Jim and I come in helping our clients get through that process. Next slide, please. So in order to participate in the program, and I know usually when people see this pyramid, they want to start at the top, but you actually need to start at the bottom. In order to receive FEMA public assistance, you have to be an eligible applicant. You have to have an eligible facility. The work has to be eligible, and the cost has to be reasonable. So eligible applicants include states, territories, local governments, tribal governments, districts, school districts like yours. Even political subdivisions can be an eligible FEMA applicant. Next slide, please. So regarding a facility, now this is a general overview of the entire program. We're going to get into specifics of the COVID event and category B later, but we're just doing an overview of everything. So in normal disasters that aren't biological, you would have your eligible facility could include any type of system, a flood control system, a navigation system, buildings, sewage treatment plants, water supplies, those types, or any building structure or system, including those used for education and recreational and cultural purposes, is considered your eligible facility. If you have ownership of it and it's been damaged in an event, then your facility is eligible. FEMA categorizes work into different levels from A to G. There are two categories of emergency work: debris removal and emergency protective measures. For the COVID-19 event, it's an emergency protective measure and a category B type event. Saying that means, or because of that, there are specific guidelines for what is considered emergency protective measures. This event is unprecedented. None of us have ever could imagine the type of things that you're, as school districts, that you're having to perform. But in order to get FEMA funding for those activities, they have to meet two important criteria. They have to be activities related to eliminating the threat of danger to the public and protecting property. Next slide, please. So to be an eligible cost, it has to be directly related to the event. It has to be adequately documented. We talked about earlier, in the earlier presentation, talked about FEMA only making sure that insurance proceeds are looked at first before going to FEMA, because they won't pay for anything that, they won't duplicate benefits, whether it's from insurance or grants, and we've said that a few times, but that should stick in because it happens all the time. And it's also the result of quite a few overpayments throughout the process. Sometimes FEMA won't do the insurance allocation on a timely basis. So this will cause the client or the subrecipient to get paid, and then the insurance hits. So guess what happens? There is called a deobligation, and you have to give back the funds that were paid before the insurance allocation was done. So that's something to be on the lookout for certain. The costs have to be consistent with your internal policies and regulations, and they have to be necessary and reasonable. Right before this presentation started, I was actually working with a client to make sure that a sole source contract, that we had proved reasonableness for it in order for them to get reimbursed by the state. So cost reasonableness and procurement are two very important issues when it comes to public assistance. Next slide, please. So let's talk specifically about COVID in Category B and FEMA funding. As previously mentioned, for this disaster, the cost share is 75% federal, 25% non-federal. The incident period does go through January 20th. It's ongoing. The declaration date, the president declared it on March 13th. As of this morning, and probably going forward for some time, the requests for public assistance are still being accepted because a deadline has not been established by FEMA. Once that deadline is established, they will let you know, because the importance of it is two things. Normally, during an event, a Category B event, you have 60 days from the time you submit the RPA to complete the work, or 60 days from the end of the event to complete the work, whichever is longer. Well, in this incident, the end of the event is going to be the longest, because we don't know when that will be. But again, as soon as that is established, California OES and FEMA will communicate that to all participants in the public assistance program, because they know how important it is. Category B, again, is the only category of work that has been declared. I think in California, you do have some individual assistance available for crisis counseling, but that's not in all 50 states. And the declaration is, of course, national. So for this event, not only is it unprecedented in what the impacts are, it's also caused FEMA to realize where its shortcomings are in a type of event like this, because it's virtually impossible to send representatives to every state, to every applicant, to document what the damages are. So what they did was they took their existing grants portal and they added an application just for the COVID event. And I'm sure you've seen notices for the virtual applicant briefings that were sent out either by California OES, or if you are a previous FEMA applicant and you had work that you were still working on, you were active on their site, you probably got a notice there to attend these virtual meetings. I think they ran until May 21st. I don't think they're still going on, but I'm sure if there's a need to, they will restart them again. But I think FEMA feels that everybody is pretty much getting into the process now. So once you attended that meeting or got a notice from California OES on how to start your FEMA portal application, you went into the system. You could fill out your RPA at that moment. I'm sure some of you have done that. And then you would start what they call the streamlined process. After you get through identifying your company profile, you actually get into the meat of what the application is for. What are your damages? What are your costs? What are your projected costs for the next 30 days? And I think FEMA has emphasized that if you are projecting the cost, if you don't have the actual cost at this moment, You can project the cost for 30 days. And once, once they review it, and even if you want to put in a immediate needs or emergency, I think they call it immediate needs funding, you can request 50% of what your actual plus projected costs are through 30 days, and they will fund you, I want to say within a time frame of 14 days, but don't hold me to that because it changes. They will fund you 50% of what those estimated costs are just to get the money to the applicants and on the street. And then after you get your final documentation in, you can go back into the system and upload actual information. Now, all of this has to go through an approval process, even if you're doing the immediate needs and you sign off on it. FEMA obligates the project worksheet, your funding becomes available, and you can start drawing down your funds. So the important things to remember about the COVID event, because it is biological, there aren't physical damages that we know of. All the activities undertaken as a result of your response to COVID may not be deemed eligible. They have to neatly fit in to the Category B emergency work guidelines, which means those activities taken to eliminate immediate threat to the public and health, and those activities taken to protect properties from this very same event. There are multiple funding sources out there. We talked about it earlier in the earlier presentation. So you want to be very careful that you don't duplicate benefits. And I think all three presentations emphasize that because no one ever wants to see an applicant have to pay back money just by mistakenly not realizing that you got funding for the same activity from somewhere else. So, next slide, thank you. Some of the activities, and I had to be, prior to this, I had a few slides that actually applied to states and counties. So to shorten this for school systems, this slide remained. So some of the other emergency protective measures that may be eligible under FEMA funding, and it was brought up in the other one regarding food. Whoever or whatever entities has the legal responsibility for providing food is the entity that would get reimbursed. If the Department of Education had the legal was the legal authority to distribute food, and they were an eligible FEMA applicant, then they would get reimbursed. So you have to be very careful, like the other presentation said. You have to be careful about where the authority lies in order to get reimbursed. But water, ice, medicine, consumables, those type things may not apply to school systems, but these are just other eligible activities. Movement of supplies and persons, security. There may be instances where you needed to secure your school because nobody was there. So if you hired a temporary security company to make sure that the school was safe, you would want to think that that's an eligible expense, eligible FEMA expense, but you need to think about whether or not it fits neatly into that category, because that's what FEMA is going to do. It's going to come back with why was the security needed, how long were they there, what did they do, that type of thing. And only FEMA has the final word on eligibility. There are probably lots of activities that school systems are performing out there that you have questions about. We can give you advice. The California OES can give you advice, and they're probably more correct. But the final determination on that item's eligibility has to come from FEMA. So please be very careful. And Letty will get into some of the details about this in her presentation, but some of, just brushing on it, some of the general documentation for documenting your COVID activities include any type of certifications or permits that you had to go out and get, procurement documentation for this event. Procurement under exigent circumstances was recommended by FEMA. They have a policy on it. They understand that in the type of emergency, you can't go out and get 3 quotes sometimes. But at the same time, when you do have to go out in an emergency, they want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence and the costs that you are accumulating are reasonable. So just keep whatever documentation that you use to make the decision to go with a particular vendor, just make sure that you have that available when you file your claim for public assistance. Proof of
Lois,
payment.
Tom Duffy here, and I'll give you a moment to take a sip of water. You've been talking for quite some time, providing excellent information. But just back to the certifications and permits. So if a district, as we discussed before, is securing a DSA facility that it may have in place temporarily, but that may be over the next year, maybe for a period of time, is that an eligible cost? Because the district would not be normally bringing that facility in had it not been for COVID-19. The cost for the architect and also the cost for the DSA certification, the DSA approval.
I would answer that that would not be an eligible cost because of the stringent guidelines for category B work. Now, that doesn't say that as a consultant, if my client felt strongly that this is something that they could justify as fitting into category B, we would definitely help them make that argument. But in working with clients here in Louisiana, we have had some issues like that come up. First of all, I would reach out to FEMA on this one before doing it. If you want to pass it through the public assistance program and you think this is an eligible item, I would call my PDGM at FEMA, and I would and they promote it. They want you to, because they don't want to have to tell you no on something that you're thinking would be eligible. So they would like to give you the information up front. But personally, on my experience, I don't think that would be an eligible expense, even though it is because of COVID that you're securing this building. I think FEMA would classify this as an additional operating expense instead of a category B emergency work item. But I could be wrong. That's why I personally would get FEMA's input on the item.
So it's something for us to explore further. Then thank you very much.
Yes. So other general documentation includes your insurance, your declaration pages, proof of payment. Believe it or not, we're working Katrina 2005 projects, and we're still, and I have clients who are still looking for canceled checks from 2005, 6, and 7. And as you know, banks only keep a history for 7 years or less. So I must tell you, if you can grab that proof of payment information and store it somewhere with the item, that's the best rule of thumb, because having to look for it after the fact, and you can't close out a project without it, having to look for it after the fact is a real headache, especially 12 years after the event. Next slide, please. Jennifer touched a little on forced account labor. I had a client recently who didn't want to listen to me, though she pays us. She felt very strongly that the work that her administrative staff was performing during COVID, and I'm talking about her salaried personnel, not her hourly personnel, she felt very strongly that FEMA would be flexible and allow it. They didn't, because again, for category B emergency work, and it's in the policy guide, it's in the 44 CFR, it takes the act of Congress to change these rules, literally. So only overtime for category B is an eligible expense. And it has to be overtime directly related to reducing a threat or protecting the public health or securing property during the event. Anything outside of that is a normal operating expense, not reimbursable by FEMA. In order to prove your claim, you should keep labor summaries, payroll records, payroll registers, any type of policy that you enacted because of the COVID event. I can't tell you how many times internal policies have helped our clients with their claims. Proof of ownership. I'm sorry, I'm still on. Yeah, we're talking about equipment as well. Even I'm moving from force account labor to force account equipment. So any type of equipment that was used, I can't give you an example for COVID. I could probably give you 100 for a hurricane, but I can't give you an example of any type of equipment that would have been used for cleaning equipment, probably. Any type of cleaning. If you have an employee who was working overtime, disinfecting a building and used a specialized some kind of machinery to do it or some kind of equipment to do it, not only is his overtime eligible, but the time he spent using that equipment to sanitize is also eligible for reimbursement. So make sure that you have, not only do you have timesheets, but a good rule of thumb is to have activity logs for those people who are working overtime to show exactly, because they're going to come back and ask you. If you just turn in overtime information, they're going to come back and ask you, well, what were they doing? So it's good to have justification, some sort of activity log attached to the timesheet. It takes extra time. Employees hate it, but it's worth getting reimbursed for items that you're eligible to get reimbursed for. Next slide, please. Materials, you want to make sure that you have invoices, purchase orders. You want to make sure for certain that you have the proper procurement. The note right there just says that for COVID-19, it qualified for an emergency and exigent circumstance, meaning that you could use non-competitive procurement, but you still have to follow guidelines. And just a little rule of thumb about your procurement procedures, you're going to follow your own internal policies first, and you're going to go with what the state and federal say. But if there's ever a question and you're confused as to which one to use, always go with the most stringent when it comes to public assistance. Whichever one has the most stringent policy, go with that one. But always, you know, use your internal one first. Same thing for rented equipment. You would get the same type: invoices, receipts, procurement information, and signed contracts for sure. And what I do whenever a client tells me that they got services performed and they didn't go out for bid, which I hate to hear, I just, whenever we formulate the claim, because the claim it's usually eligible, they just didn't follow the proper procedures. We're not talking millions of dollars. I'm talking about small items. What I do is when I file the claim or when we submit the claim, we make sure that we've done a cost reasonableness assessment report, which tells what the circumstances were for choosing the sole source, what the background on the work is, and our best, usually we use internal cost estimators to help us prove the reasonableness. But if we can do just if it's a small item and we can do quotes ourselves, we'll go and pull them, because that's one less thing FEMA will come back and ask you about. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Jim so I can breathe.
Thanks, Lois. That's great. So appreciate that. One of the things I love about working with Lois is her passion in protecting her clients. It's one of the things that I've learned to really respect about her and enjoy. So what do you get? How does the process work? Why would you want an advocate, a PA assistance? I mean, you break it kind of into two main categories: grant management, administrative services, and then kind of the technical side of the support. as you recognize and listening to Lois talk about it, you get an advocate, you get an expert who understands and has gone through it. This may be a one-off event for you, a first-time event for you, but you know, with a PA consultant, now you get somebody who's got years of experience dealing with this, working with FEMA, and will be on your side relative to those discussions about what is reasonable, what isn't, and eligibility. Obviously, the administration of the cost, the administration of the documentation, the appeals process, all of these things are going to be a little bit foreign to you if you've never gone through it. And your normal approach to record keeping isn't going to cut it relative to what is going to happen with FEMA. And so having an assistant there to work through that with you can be extremely beneficial. Lois mentioned multiple times about cost reasonableness. This is a big part of the equation, and you have to justify every time you make a sole source decision. And obviously in an emergency, you're going to have to make sole source decisions in order to move quickly and respond to protecting life and the property there. So having that support in-house will allow you to move through it. Our goal and the goal of a good PA is to minimize your exposure, your risk associated with the event, associated with what you're dealing with, and to maximize your ability to recover the funds. You know, Lois is proud of her track record. I think it's like 2,500 projects that she's managed throughout her career, and none have ever been denied, and she's never had to return any money to FEMA. So that's what you get when you hire an expert. It just allows you and your staff to focus on what you're dealing with, the crisis, and allows you to have an expert in your pocket to help you navigate the situation. Next slide.
Can I stop you before you go to the next slide? One question that was asked earlier dealt with buses. We actually have a current school district who posed a question very similar. And the question was, she wanted to know whether or not they were about to procure some additional bus services for their summer program because of distancing on the bus. And she wanted me to verify for her that the additional services would be eligible. So first we went to the state PA who said, no, sorry, it's the normal operating cost. But then I wasn't satisfied with that answer. It just didn't seem right, because to me, you can actually see category B work, you know, happening. They can't sit close on the bus. This definitely falls into that category of protecting them against imminent danger. So why would that be in normal operating costs? We elevated it to FEMA, and I must tell you, I just checked the other day, they're still talking about it because it makes sense. They had not been asked that question here in our area, and that's something that they're probably want to give us the right answer to. They see our argument, but just accepting it from state PA as being a normal operating expense just didn't sit well. So as soon as we do find out whether or not FEMA is going to deem that eligible here in this area, we'll definitely share that information. But I think they will have to, because it seems to fit into that category of work.
So Lois, Jim, this is Julie. Question coming through, and I had the same question, is if, especially small districts, if you need, or big districts, or any district, if you're hiring a PA support company, is that a reimbursable FEMA expense?
Yeah, go to the next slide and we'll talk about that actually.
It's on the next slide.
Yeah, so FEMA anticipates that there's a management cost associated. Now this is internal management cost or external management cost, but essentially the answer to the question is yes. If you hire a management consultant to work with you, it is reimbursable under the FEMA guidelines, and they anticipate 7% at the state level for management costs, and they anticipate 5% at the applicant or they're at the school district level to work through that. And that and then if you do hire an external consultant like a Vanner, we would then track all of those costs and make sure they're categorized. Somebody else had a question about, so we cannot claim indirect costs, and that's correct. The direct costs can be reimbursed. The indirect cost would not be reimbursed. And it's important how that information is tracked. Lois, we've talked about this, right? So having a meeting associated with a specific discussion about the bus or about cleaning supplies or this sort of thing would be a direct cost from your management consultant for them to participate in that meeting. But if you had a general opening meeting with your consultant to discuss the overall issues faced by the district, that would be classified as an indirect cost. So a good consultant will obviously work to minimize the indirect costs and focus their attention on the very specific details of the specific projects and impacts that you're encountering as a school district. So we set up our cost tracking structure to manage all that effectively so that you can. Now those indirect costs can be part of your 25% sharing, because as a district, you've got the 75% that FEMA will reimburse. There's 25% that has to be captured and paid for by the district, and those indirect costs would fall into that 25% bucket. Lois, anything else to add to that?
No, but depending on what the indirect cost is, I've made some very good, successful arguments on things that were initially said by FEMA to be indirect. But if you can support it really well, again, by the proper documentation, what was discussed, who was there, why the discussion was needed, and the effects on the project, things like that. If it's very important to you, we can justify the item, then, and it's indirect. Sometimes you can get them to sway in your favor for making something eligible. Yes.
And I think you said it a minute ago, Lois. I mean, ultimately, FEMA's objective is to reimburse the applicants. That's the subrecipients. I mean, that's their goal. They're not trying to withhold the funds. They have a process and they have requirements that they want to make sure are met. But ultimately, their objective is to get the money in the hands of the subrecipients, the applicants.
Yes, and I heard that there's like 2,000 applicants active for COVID in the state of California. So that's a lot of applicants, and they're very anxious to get the money out on the street.
And unless there's questions for us, that concludes our presentation.
Thank you all.
Jim, Lois, before you leave, I've got a quick question. We talked about keeping and documenting bank statements, cancel checks. Does FEMA accept scanned items?
Yes, most definitely.
You don't need originals.
You don't need originals. Scanned items work just fine. Yes. Matter of fact, they prefer scanned items. And especially with this new streamlined process, like I said, the whole purpose is to, it was astronomical as to how they were going to attack this and get the claims process. And the only way to do it, and it seems to be working pretty well, is to streamline a process on their e-grants portal. So yes.
Jim and Lois, Tom Duffy here again. So nationwide for all 50 states and territories, how much money is available through FEMA to assist with school districts and others that may be seeking it?
That is a question I was not posed, but I've never been posed before, but I will find out the answer and get back to you, Tom. I don't think they're going to run out, but I will get that exact number to you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be other questions coming up, but we'll go ahead and move on to our next, because we have Cash's very own Letty Boggs, and she's going to talk about accounting, auditing expectations. So Letty, are you there?
I'm here.
Good to see you.
Hi. So you're going to hear a lot of reinforcing, basically, of what Lois has been sharing with you, because we're both kind of coming at it from that accounting angle and what we have to do to make it work. So FEMA is being administered in California by Cal OES. But if you're looking for really good information, documentation, it is the FEMA documentation that's going to help you understand what the process is. They have good guidance on the website, various links that you can go to read up on the sections in the code. Those things are all FEMA, and that was part of the confusion early on. We were getting our guidance from Cal OES, but we needed to be pointed to the actual FEMA documentation. So be sure that when you're doing your FEMA work and you're figuring out what goes to what, that you're not double dipping. That's a real important element. And we'll talk a bit about the rigorous FEMA audit requirements. Oh, I'm trying to hit my arrow. It's not me, it's Sam. Thank you, Sam. So the process, just so you're aware, it's a little bit different than our other processes. There are a couple of things I want to point out that's very similar to what Lois showed you. But after you make your request for public assistance, you get assigned a manager. That manager is available to answer your specific questions. And as Lois said, you want to ask them ahead of time, get kind of a understanding of what it is they'll need documentation and whether an item would be allowable. So you want to be sure you're doing that with your manager. So it's really important to get that RPA in place now, if you haven't already, so that you get assigned a manager and you have a contact person you can ask specific questions. And then you go through your process, and then you do the Streamlined app toward the end. You can change your amount all the way through the process, so you don't worry about making an estimate now and not being able to change it. We have state programs in California where you can't change things. So we're not quite used to that. Oh, I had change orders and I had different things. This one you can modify all the way up through and including your final submittal period. Okay. You want to be sure that you're designating a unique project identifier in the coding. This is the same as we do for an SFP project. You can put it in the very same place you do. And in fact, the facility department may be able to help the broader district in understanding how you account for a project. And think of these expenditures as a project that you're going to need to maintain project documentation. You're going to need to keep it all in one place. You're going to have a ability to do notes to file, justifications of what you did. So be sure that you're coding that where you code a project identifier in your system. The reality is in California, we see them in different parts of the coding stream. And so it's not specific to, there's one location for it. We see it in goal, we see it in cost, we see it in management code. Just be sure you have it and that you can order your ledger cut with all of the costs that you've coded to that expense. You're already accumulating costs, probably accumulated costs before you began to use the unique identifier for your event costs, your FEMA. So you'll need to do a transfer, and that's really important to understand right now because it's a whole lot easier to transfer in the current fiscal year than to try and to restate things from a prior year. So as we are on a March to June 30th and those days are getting short, please go back and look and make sure you get as much as you can in place in your unique identifier. At this point, it will simplify your life later. Oh, okay, next. Yes, so one important thing you need to do, and you'll see this as you begin to read through the FEMA documentation, they are going to really look at this audit based on your own policies. What are your company policies, your district? So you have in your district, in your board policy already, a purchasing policy, a payment policy, and a conflict of interest policy. You need to pull those and read them and make sure you're doing what you're doing per your policy. those policies get adjusted so seldom. We find that people often are not aware of what the actual policy says. And most of you will find you've followed the CSBA guidelines for policy, and the policy is actually very brief. But you should have an accompanying regulation that implements that policy. And those sometimes are get out of date. Nobody's looked at them. You want to make sure you are actually following your own policy, because they're going to audit you to that. It's actually good practice anyway. So one of the things that can help you make sure that you're implementing policy and regulation is to go through and do some analysis of what your workflow is. How do we go in order? These are a couple ways. When we're doing them with the department, we do the post-it notes, then we formalize it into a flow chart. This is a really good way to implement it, because now you're able to look at, okay, we actually run through these 4 people and our conflict of interest policy is met. We have redundancy in this decision where we should have redundancy, 2 sets of eyes. All those pieces are in place. Make sure you've got that. And it's going to give you good workflow so that you're humming at a pretty good clip as you get all of this work going and get this issues addressed. Okay. Next. Yeah. Okay. You're going to need to track this grant like a very heavy audit requirement. So think back, those of you who were with us for the really tough days of SFP audits from OPSC, when they used to require copious amounts of documentation. Think that plus a little bit. So seriously, it's good money, and money's going to be tight, and you're going to need the funding, but this funding comes at a documentation level that you're not used to for any of the other audits you experience in California. The good news is we're actually well, can you go back one? Yeah, hold on there. So you want to be sure that you are documenting in a way that you would keep project documentation. I lost my thought, let me get. So you have a heavy audit requirement. You're going to need to save all your procurement documentation. Usually we go through procurement, and once we've done the procurement, for most of our audits, the purchasing documentation, the PO or the contract is sufficient, and we don't always save all of our working papers. So be sure you talk to purchasing and that they're saving their working papers on how they made the decision. For instance, when you have your, you have a policy of getting 3 quotes. So something's under the bid limit, but you require 3 quotes. A lot of districts we see have a 3-quote analysis document, and then somebody signs off on the recommended quote. Okay, save that working paper in addition to the PO or contract that developed. Okay, so one of the things you're going to be able to do in the moment that's hard to do later is that analysis of whether it was a good price for the product. So if you're doing that analysis, write it down, stick it in there, scan it and save it, or document it on a digital document and save it in your project record, because real-time analysis of competitive pricing it's easy to get it in the moment, and you probably have your hands on it right then. Save it, save it, save it. So when you're in an emergency and you're doing purchasing and you have the exception of urgency and emergency resolutions, you may need to get something. So you may have needed to acquire your first box of masks, your first buy of masks without going through the process. But ever after that, you have time to do the proper process. And I think if you have time to do the process, document it, and save it. Because if you have time to do the good purchasing practice, you really should do that. And that will make your time with your audit much smoother. So if you're, if you go to hard bid something, be sure you work with your attorney. If you're hard bidding something that you're going to try to claim on this, you really, really need to make sure that you're putting all the documentation in correctly. And by the way, should we have a sudden earthquake or something else and you have a different kind of FEMA event where much more building related, this is a really important one to understand, that you have to have the right clauses and pieces. In California, we're very used to heavy compliance. You're all in better shape than many places in the United States where they don't already follow all the purchasing requirements that we follow in California. We're actually in very well equipped and well schooled on these practices. We just need to keep the documents. Okay. It's granular in a sense that we've never had to do before. So you want to keep timesheets and work logs. And like Lois mentioned, you need like a daily log from your folks who are doing this work of what they were doing, not just that they were at Franklin Elementary doing deep clean. What were they doing? What equipment did they use? How many hours were they doing it? That's the kind of level of record keeping that they're going to want. You might want to consider what you consider a project. Talk to your project manager about it. If you're a large district, you may want to break it down into regional applications or application per school. Just know that as you make it one big district app, you kind of have to pass the whole audit for all of everything for the whole district before the final money will flow on that app. So think it through, talk to your manager about that. And of course, keep related documents. One of the things that is important is that we find some storage systems purge the accounting records. So now many of the accounting systems have the ability to attach documents, but they purge them on a much shorter time frame then you're going to need your FEMA documentation. So be sure that you're saving it somewhere where you have control, that it will not get purged before you need it for the audit. So you may need to duplicate some of what's saved in your normal accounting methodology, much like you do in your facility audits. Save it in your own duplicated project record and keep that project record until you're all finished, and plus 3 years, I think it is. So it has a long time frame. I think that was my last slide, right? Oh, nope, got another one. Okay, so you have CARES Act funding. That's 100%, but it's limited, very limited. It's going into your accounting. They are using that already. They have their own resource code. The FEMA money is different. It reimburses at 75%, and you have a little bit more control over what you're claiming under FEMA. The two funding sources work very differently. So have a conversation with your fiscal director, your CBO, to make sure that you know what you're coding to FEMA and what they're covering under CARES Act. CARES Act in most districts is tending to fund the distance learning elements of hotspots, equipment, all the distance learning components, because that is not a piece that FEMA is covering. So, and it eats up pretty much the CARES Act funding in a lot of places. Okay, they don't cover the same things. Be sure you're putting together a strategy so that you can get your coding in place and your tracking set up. So good luck. Hope it goes well. That's it, I think, for mine. Yes? Yeah. Thank you. Any questions?
Letty, there was a question from April. She was asking, can districts use SAC's resource code 5650?
I don't know. I would have to look it up, but they can't use it as a unique identifier if it's ever used for anything else. So you want to pick a unique identifier that is not a code, that a generalized code. You want a very specific code. So let's say all of your facility project codes start with a 9, 9601, 9602. You're going to want to put your unique identifier code somewhere very different. And I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head that resource code, so I can't answer that. I'm very specific to managing facility coding, actually. been a long time since I was a CBO.
Letty, if I can go back to both you and also to Lois.
Yeah, just a sec. I see that April posted that the 5650 is the FEMA public assistance. Yes, you would put that in your resource, but you need a unique identifier for your actual FEMA project. So you put that in your goal or in your management code, somewhere like that. Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
No, thank you. So with districts facing, as Lois has said, something we've never faced before, the country's never faced before, and with expenditures that districts may be making in order to create safe environments to welcome students back in let's say August, as in your district, Julie, or the county office in Jeff's district with one of his programs. If it's deemed that they need assistance from medical personnel, such as nurses that they don't have, most school districts don't have credentialed nurses, but if they deem that they need assistance from a nurse, or maybe they need a doctor, they need a medical team to assist them, is that something that is an eligible cost to the district? And if it's something that they've never done before, do they need additional documentation to say, this is why we don't have a board policy on this because we've never dealt with it before, but we believe and made a determination that we need these professionals to assist us to create this safe environment, welcome back, because they may be assisting in not simply taking temperatures, but making evaluations, both of staff and students.
While you were talking, my brain was running. So, I was comparing it to, what's needed for ADA. So how does that apply? And the best answer I could come up with, listening to you, and Letty may have more to add, the best answer I could come up with is what you pretty much said. I would document it, and then I would have a conversation with my project delivery officer, my PDGM from FEMA, because this is unprecedented for them. I never go into thinking about an eligible cost like that as them just automatically saying no, because there could be some circumstances surrounding that could get it to fit into that category B work category. So I wouldn't say no, but I would say that it needs further discussion with the project delivery manager from FEMA.
And Lois, in your experience working with Katrina and the other 2,500 applicants that you've assisted, has there been something like that where an entity, a public entity, has identified need for some kind of medical assistance or some other professional assistance? We've talked. Yes.
Yes, and it has been on a circumstance. That's why I said you would need to have that conversation with the FEMA project delivery manager, because it's you. If you can make an argument that is justifiable within the scope of the policy, then FEMA will. They're not as harsh as we sometimes portray them to be. They will consider your argument and apply it to policy. And sometimes, if the argument is really good, if it's strong, they will make that item eligible. That's why I said for this one, I would first seek their assistance, because this is new to all of us. But and to give you my honest opinion, I'm swaying toward it being eligible, but I could be wrong.
Thank you, Lois. And the other thought was, and it takes me back to, I think, one of Fred's slides, or Jennifer's slides, that identified social emotional area. It takes me back to the discussion we had a couple of weeks ago with our Cash Moms, where one of the mothers of a young child said her little boy was concerned about going back to school. So beyond medical personnel, if we need additional counseling personnel assistance in that way, maybe this is another area. I'm not asking you a question, I'm basically making a statement. This may be another area for us to explore.
Well, I do know in California, crisis management individual assistance is also available. So it might just fall into that category. So that is a definite avenue as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If I could return to the resource question with a little bit more fleshed out answer as I've thought about it. The reason you need a unique identifier in addition to the FEMA resource code is because, God forbid, but you may have another event before you've finished audit with this event. So it is very feasible that you could have a fire or a flood or an earthquake before you finish audit on this event, kind of the way this year's been going, hey. So you want to be sure that this event has a unique code in addition to that resource. That's the purpose of that, so that if you have another FEMA claim running, it runs on its own unique identifier. Sorry, that's just clarification.
And Julie, there's another question relating to leasing of temporary portables and whether it would be eligible. We covered that, I think, before. And what I would say is keep your documents and make the case.
Yeah, I think it sounds good. I think both with what Lois and Letty are strongly urging is that almost we treat it like our insurance, where we do a pre-authorization for anything large, and to make sure that we're looking to FEMA, you know, before you start going down that path, that we're going to get a pre-authorization or an okay from them to kind of move towards that direction. So great information, really makes you really start thinking about the best way to document things. And they're absolutely right. Who knows, especially in Southern California, we could have an earthquake at any time on top of our COVID issues. So, okay, up next, we have legal considerations, because in school districts, we always think about legal considerations in seeking FEMA funding. We've got Addison Covert from Parker and Covert. Hey, Addison, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you very much, Julie. Let's move. Oh, you're already on that first slide. You're way ahead of me. Can everybody hear and see me okay? Good.
Yes.
Before I get started with my general comments, I just wanted to make one observation. This is my third webinar through CASH on these related topics. My first one in which I've been given an opportunity to speak, but I noticed from the first two when I was attending as a member of the audience, the attorney was always at the end. So when I was asked to speak at this one, it was interesting to me that I was at the end as the attorney. And I was hoping and assuming that maybe I had a wrap-up role, or I had an opportunity to answer questions that hadn't been yet addressed, or there was something significant about me being at the end with the other lawyers during these webinars. And then I was politely told, oh, we might run out of time, and that's the one topic that we can afford to not have enough time for the presenter. So that really kind of took the wind out of my sails. But we've stayed on track today, so I think I am going to have enough time to go through my comments, and let me jump right in. I think we're all aware of the fact that in March of 2020, President Trump declared California a disaster area for purposes of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's important to take into consideration what we've heard earlier today, which is that FEMA is in a position to provide expense reimbursement all the way back into January, with March 22nd not being the triggering event, but instead those reimbursements are going to go back even earlier in the calendar year. And we'll talk a little bit later in some of the other slides about that timing issue. But that is important, that action on the part of the president, because it opened up the FEMA process, so to speak, to California school districts with respect to seeking funding from FEMA for the costs that were incurred as a result of that. Next slide, please. Following a right along track with the federal government's action in that regard, our own governor has been very up to speed on this process over time. And as you can see, we've highlighted 3 of the many orders that have come from his office and his staff that have sort of been in part in response to the nature of the pandemic and its impact. So we had the March 19th order, which was fairly restrictive, the March 4th order that tended to open things up, and then now we've been seeing additional openings up of the process over time, gradually in response to the evolution of the virus in the state. Next slide, please. Now, almost more importantly, most of the counties within the state have issued their own county health department guidelines and orders that are applicable to the unique events in the region. And our office, just because one of our offices is in Sacramento and I happen to be in Sacramento, I'm most familiar with the Sacramento County ordinance in this regard, and we've been monitoring it. And I'm sure each of you in your respective counties have been paying a lot of attention. But that ordinance coming out of the health department of your local county is an important legal source to obtain information on what are the guidelines that school districts locally should be adhering to. One of the things we're going to be talking about during this presentation are what are the liabilities and responsibilities of school districts in response to COVID-19. And a lot of that will flow from what is the information that's being made available to school districts, and what is it that school districts should be adhering to and modifying programs to comply with and adjust to the kinds of circumstances that these county health ordinances over time are instructing school districts to do and to be responsive to. So this is an example of the elements of Sacramento County. We've looked at several others in some of the other school districts we've worked with, and they're fairly similar in many respects, with various stages and a loosening up of the stages. We'll talk a little bit later about construction, for example, during the summer season. That was a big issue with some of our school district clients, whether or not they could keep up with school renovation and modernization during the best time of the year for construction during the summer. And of course, unfortunately, now it's turning out that almost every month of the year may be the best time of year for construction if we aren't able to get schools actively enrolled here sometime soon. Let's go to the next slide, please. One of the important issues, and Lois mentioned this earlier, is the unprecedented nature of COVID-19. And as a lawyer, when you review the statutes in California and the case law in California that pertain to extraordinary events and that pertain to the kinds of things that school districts need to be doing to adjust to those events, many of them are presuming that events are going to be one-time occurrences. We heard a lot about the events that were coming out of New Orleans, primarily Louisiana and Texas, that FEMA has responded to. Again, one-time events, but an ongoing problem like the COVID-19 situation is causing significant concerns because it changes from time to time. We're hearing initially that it's bound to get better and then flare up at some point down the line, and instead it's almost a hit or miss issue as to when it's going away. We're seeing a lot of different variations around the state, and that's making it particularly challenging for local school districts to assess their risk and to assess their liability and to adjust to that so that they can protect themselves against outside claims and protect their own students and their own staff from the ever-changing conditions of the virus. So frankly, and from our review, California law and California case law in particular are not doing a good job giving us instruction on what it is we need to be looking out for and what it is we need to be complying with. And let me point out a few examples. Well, let's take a first look at the California Constitution, Article 1. All students and staff have the right to attend campuses that are safe, secure, and peaceful. No one argues with that, but that statement in and of itself is so general, it's hard to know where we're getting our guidance on that. But we get a little bit better guidance when we see statements coming from the Constitution and from other case law. Districts can be held liable for unsafe schools when there is knowledge of a dangerous condition. But again, what is our knowledge of that dangerous condition when it's changing and evolving on a continuous basis. If we'd had an earthquake and a building became unsafe, we would know to vacate the building until it was either torn down and reconstructed or otherwise made safe, a one-time occurrence. But with COVID-19, the issue of liability and the issue of the responsibility of a school district to confirm its practices and to engage in activities to cure and correct that liability is going to be an ongoing process, which means that school districts are going to continuously be exposed to legal risk and legal liability, for which they need to be continually aware and continually adjusting to. And then, of course, the third point, this is rather fundamental. School districts can also be held liable for unsafe schools, even without knowledge, direct knowledge, if there is negligence on the part of the school district in failing to identify that unsafe condition. So it would not be enough to say, well, gee, we weren't aware particularly that the damages that occurred here or the injury that occurred here was something that was going to happen. If the general state of knowledge in the area is such that a school district should have been aware of that dangerous condition, then that could be a source of liability and a source of damages that a school district could incur under that kind of a situation. Next slide, please. These standards and policies generally are adopted by many school districts around the state. We've quoted one education code and 2 board policies. The board policies are taken right out of CSBA's model board policies, which many school districts have. But I put that first one in the education code because this sort of harkens back to what we were talking about a moment ago, which is that a lot of the underlying older law in California doesn't really contemplate COVID-19 and a pandemic. It wasn't written in a time in which people were thinking we would be having something like COVID-19 to deal with. Education Code Section 49400 is a good example of that. A governing board shall give diligent care to the health and physical development of pupils. Well, that sounds a lot like a health science class and physical education or PE, and that's important. Both of those are certainly important, but they're not giving us much guidance with respect to a pandemic and an ongoing situation like we're seeing here. Board Policy 0450, students and staff have the right to a safe campus free from physical harm. Now we're getting closer. Now we're looking at the heart of the matter. How do we maintain a campus that's free from physical harm? Clearly, if that's a board policy, and if we know that COVID-19 presents a risk of physical harm to students attending our schools and staff working at our schools, and our board policy says we are to be taking action to avoid that risk of physical harm, we've got a direct legal responsibility to comply with that in order to avoid the liability that might result from failure to do that. Board Policy 5141.31, even more on point, actually literally talking about the spread of infectious disease. Now, these really came to light when you look through these board policies in the context of making sure students are being properly vaccinated with respect to the standardized diseases in our state that can typically be protected through vaccinations. But with any luck, perhaps we'll have vaccinations due soon and available soon for COVID-19. It'll fall right clearly within this directive. And school districts will have responsibilities to ensure that students are being properly vaccinated, consistent with those standards as they're evolving, in order to provide for a safe school environment when students are back on campus and attending again. Next slide, please. Here's another case that, believe it or not, this case comes as close to really identifying a situation that might be construed to be applicable in the COVID-19 environment we're in now. The Simi Valley Unified School District had a school campus with an open gate on the back of the campus. No one on the school district was aware of the fact that that open gate exiting onto a busy boulevard represented a risk of harm to students at the district. But when a student was seriously injured as a result of walking out of that open gate and onto a busy boulevard, Simi Valley was held liable for $2.8 million in damages under the theory that it failed to determine that a dangerous condition did in fact exist somewhere at one of its schools, and the resulting damage and harm that resulted in the student that walked out on that busy boulevard resulted in a significant financial cost to the school district or its insurance carrier or both. Why is that case important? Because I think the court spent a long time in that Simi Valley case talking about unknown dangerous conditions when a school district should have, could have known about those dangerous conditions. And that's a troubling concept in the context of COVID-19. When you consider the fact that Simi Valley could have probably realistically determined through its site administrators that that gate at the rear of the campus presented a risk of harm to students, that's a knowable situation. But how can school districts, and this is a hypothetical question, but how can school districts be aware of the nature of dangerous conditions that might be existing in a school as a result of a pandemic? Anyway, it's a troubling case, and it's something I think that people need to stop and think about. At least attorneys giving advice about potential liability need to stop and think about. Next slide, please. Well, let's talk about some of that liability protection. Monitoring student activities, maintaining protocols for students and staff during attendance. And those protocols, the best ones we're seeing right now, are coming from the state and coming from those local county guidelines that we talked about earlier. What about field trips? What about student activities off campus? We may be a long ways away from those, but sooner or later, maybe sometime in 2021, we'll be seeing off-trip student activities again. What kind of protection and care should school districts be taking in those activities to exercise a level of care and responsibility that will protect them from from liability for injuries? Those are things that will need to be looked at. Liability waivers, we got a question the other day about that. By all means, think about liability waivers. They've been done at the national level at a presidential rally recently. Are they enforceable, particularly for schools where mandatory attendance of school districts in schools is a requirement? That's another question altogether. Let's skip to the next slide, please. I think we've covered that one sufficiently, and we're beginning to run short on time. So why don't we go off to the next slide, please? Let's remember that one of the things we can do for protection at a school district with respect to unknown liability is insurance coverage. One of the things risk managers at districts are going to want to be doing is to take a look at current policies at the school district in light of COVID-19, consult with your carriers, and determine if you have adequate coverage. And if not, it now may be the time to consider expanding that coverage to make sure that staff is protected, to make sure the board is protected, to make sure the district itself as an entity is protected against the kind of harm and damage that could come from a situation that could be resulting from the pandemic. Next slide, please. Let's switch our topic now over to Federal Emergency Management Agency's program, FEMA. Jennifer made an excellent point earlier in her presentation about reimbursement, and I think reimbursement carries with it an important concept, and that's important record keeping. Our office has been involved in several school districts, not with respect to the FEMA program, but with respect to other federal programs and particularly financial programs in assisting school districts putting together the kind of records and the kind of information that only the federal government really knows how to do in a very, very significant way. And that can be a daunting task if a school district has not been maintaining good ongoing record keeping on a regular basis as those records have been, as those circumstances have been occurring that have led to the preparation of those records. FEMA will reimburse for a whole variety of expenses, but I've been told, and my experience in other contexts has been that that reimbursement will be tough to get if record keeping is not being properly done. Now, how does this relate to liability and legal issues? I think it relates to liability and legal issues for an entirely separate reason but an important reason. That very same record keeping and close adherence and close attention to ongoing changing circumstances can be important evidence later on of the school district's good faith, ongoing efforts to keep up with the virus, to keep up with the changing conditions and requirements of the state and local and county governments, to prove that they were being reasonable at all times in responding to the virus and in responding to the needs of student and staff safety in light of the virus. So the two actions go hand in hand, and record keeping can be an important part of both of those goals. Next slide, please. Now, not only FEMA, but also CARES and some of the other programs, but particularly FEMA, a resolution from a school district plays a very important role in the eligibility process. And let's spend a minute or two talking about that. We're all aware of resolutions and what they do and their purpose. Typically, they make certain factual statements. They make certain school board specific findings, and other actions are taken as well. But there's some elements that would be important to include in a FEMA resolution that will be beneficial in the long run. Cal OES may require some very specific information coming out of your resolution for purposes of participating in a reimbursement program. Pay attention to that. You may even want to ask for examples of resolutions from them to make sure your resolution is hitting all the important points that are required. And FEMA as well will be in the same situation, but having backup material and the findings to support the information set forth in the resolution is something that FEMA, I understand, will frequently drill down and want to see. So maintaining good record keeping, as was mentioned in the previous slide, will be important as a source of documentation to support the resolution that, or resolutions that your school board may ultimately be asked to approve for these reimbursement procedures. Let's go to the next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about some self-serving aspects of resolutions for a moment. I think one of the important public policy statements that can come out of a resolution can not only inform the board about the purpose of the program that they're being asked to approve or the purpose of the findings they're being asked to make, but that resolution, when it becomes a published document at a school board meeting and is released to the press, may be an important source of information to the press and the general public about what the school district is engaged in and is doing, and in this regard, in response to the pandemic. For example, if the resolution is making particular findings about what steps and actions the school district has been taking in response to changing conditions under the virus, specifically activities it may be engaged in the areas of staff training, in the areas of facility sanitation, in the areas of the protection and distancing of students and staff. Having that in the resolution is a real-time, written, permanent record of what the school district was doing at the point in time in which it was taking those activities that can provide not only the justification for the FEMA funding reimbursements that you're seeking on an immediate basis, but good long-term evidence that can show real-time data to a court in a situation in which the district was having to defend itself against a claim of damages suffered at the staff level or at the student level. So those resolutions can play an important dual role going forward in this process. Again, you know, a hurricane is a terrible event. A tornado is a terrible event, but it happens in an afternoon and it's over. And then we engage in cleanup, and then we're worried, we address the situation going forward. But with something that is of an ongoing nature, like the pandemic that we're in now, having this ongoing written record of the actions that were taken over time by school districts in response to the continuously released orders from the local counties can be an important component to protecting the district against liability in the long haul. Next slide, please. Questions and answers. I'm finished. Thank you very much for having me.
Addison, this is Julie. I think we had a question from the chat, which is it too late to adopt board policies that could help us with liability? I may have been kind of wrapped in with your resolution that you're talking about for FEMA.
That's a good question, and I'm going to answer it preliminarily with a quick answer. And my quick answer would be, it's never too late to take corrective action like that. And the reason I use the word corrective action is I'm assuming that district perceives they don't have good policies in place right now, or at least inadequate policies in place right now. And I don't think you'd be faulted if you're adopting policies that are specifically targeted towards dealing with the unique characteristics of COVID-19. No one could have been expected at the local school district level to be adequately protected by an earthquake policy or by a hurricane policy in light of COVID-19. But now that districts are aware of what those requirements are, I think there's value to taking a look at your policies and updating them. And that puts you in the enviable position of being able to say, we felt like our policies were inadequate. We took immediate action to update them so that we could adhere to those policies and get the proper protection for students and staff. So I would encourage people to take a good, positive look at that. Thanks.
Addison, I think, yeah, I know in conversations with some of our directors here at our district, liability is our #1 concern with students and staff back on campus come for us, August 5th. If, you know, many of the our county offices are sending, as you saw, the PPE supplies, and one of those was thermometers. If a district chooses not to test for temperature, staff or students coming back on campus, could that be considered a liability since that equipment was offered?
I would have to come back to the earlier remarks of the presentation. There's going to be a reasonable standard of conduct. We don't know what it is today, but unfortunately, courts are going to determine what that reasonable standard of conduct should have been in June and July of 2020, and they're going to apply that to what was occurring then, which right now for us is now. So if it turns out to be the case that it's reasonable for school districts to get those thermometers and to utilize those thermometers and to screen students and staff, and for those who aren't passing some level of adequate health, to prevent them from attending school, and that turns out to be the standard that we're in right now, then yes, there's risk in not undertaking that particular action. We don't know now whether that is a reasonable standard, but if people are perceiving that it might later on become the reasonable standard, then the best course of conduct now would be to follow that action.
Okay, and let's say we take every action that has been identified by the federal government in protecting our students and staff at schools. And, you know, of course, lo and behold, someone still becomes infected. In many cases, we've seen that with our younger students, it doesn't seem to be as detrimental to them as it would be to our staff that may be a little older and have an underlying medical issue. I guess that's the big concern there with having people back on campus. You are worried that if they trace it back to becoming ill from the school itself, and if someone is permanently injured, you know, or death results, what is that liability there with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And two ideas pop into my head immediately. First of all, litigators will say it's going to be the particular facts of a particular case are going to determine what the liability is. But that having, and let me just expand very briefly on that. If a school district's activities have been very reasonable in all regards, and we've talked about that earlier, and this was a situation in which it was almost unpreventable, then that's going to have the impact of limiting the school district's responsibility. How much it limits it, whether it limits it down to 0 is impossible to know. But the second factor, I would have to say, and I don't mean to be flippant about this, but school districts are not Disneyland. Disneyland people have the opportunity to decide to go and take the risk or not go and not take the risk. Public schools in California, the state of California has the mandatory responsibility to provide an appropriate public education to students. Now, if we've opened up a school and said, here it is, come to our open school, we think it's safe, and we do the best we can to make it safe, and a student ends up getting injured, I think that's a situation in which school districts will get a little certain amount of credit towards the good side for providing an environment and working hard to provide an environment that's safe. But nevertheless, if a student gets ill there, and in your hypothetical, you said it was at the school they got ill, that could potentially be some liability there. And that's why I think, as that earlier slide mentioned, having some heart-to-heart conversations with your insurance carriers, whoever they are, about what the level of your liability could be and what the level of your current insurance policies and protection are, now is as good a time as any to be doing that.
Well, Addison, we had you on last because we saved the best for last. And that's, that's exactly why. So, well, thank you so much. I appreciate all, the great conversation makes all of us, again, that stress level for us, having students and staff back at school as we try and juggle with what we know, with where our liability is, what we can do, and then getting reimbursement. It's still such a moving target that we just try and put all the best information we can together.
Julie, it's Tom, and there was a question from Joanne Branch about legislation and liability, and I just want to go back to what Addison was talking about, and also back to the webinar that we held on risk and liability, and the recognition that as Addison was saying, the facts of the case will determine really merits of the case. So what do we have for employees? For employees, if they are assigned to a school site and they become ill, that may be the remedy for that may be workers' compensation, that they would receive medical treatment that would be paid for through the workers' comp program. They would receive time off. So that remedy is something that's in place. We don't have such a thing in place for students or parents or volunteers that may come onto a school site. And I think that's why looking very carefully at how we create this reentry that seems to be the focus of everyone today is so important. And taking temperatures, requiring the use of masks, shields for teachers or others that may get close to students. I think those kinds of things are being considered by districts and need to be considered, because they would, as you pointed out, Addison, they would be something that could be pointed to and relied upon to say, we did take extraordinary efforts. You talked about waivers. Well, we can't ask someone to sign a waiver to come to school. Well, in these circumstances, what's the other end of the spectrum? Is it taking extraordinary efforts to make sure that we help people identify whether or not they're ill and should come onto the school campus or not? I think that's where we are today. I think we're at that other end of the spectrum, because we do know that this virus is prevalent, and we do know that it is something that can be given if people are in close proximity to one another. And so efforts that we make to control those environments, I think, are part of the protection in the event there would be some challenge by a parent who says, my child is ill and you're responsible for that because you invited them onto the school campus.
Or even when my child became ill, contracted the COVID-19 at school, brought it home, and grandma died.
Yes.
Those are still the scary things that are being said out loud that are frightening to even think about and discuss.
And we next week we'll be talking about what districts are planning to do and how they will organize schools. I received communication from a colleague yesterday that had information about the Menifee School District in Riverside County, your county, Julie, where they basically want to offer parents a choice of either sending their child to school for in-classroom instruction, or if they want to keep them home and have their child in a distance learning circumstance, but offering that option to the parents. So I think and I'd be interested in your thought on this, Addison. In offering the option to the parents, the district is saying, I think, your level of comfort in sending your child is how you're going to make that decision. And if you send your child to our school, we're going to take, I'm believing Menifee would be saying this, we're going to take extraordinary precautions, whatever we can do. But at the same time, you're choosing to send your child into that physical space where they will encounter others. If you choose not to do that and keep your child at home, then they are opting to not put their child at some level of risk. And I think that is an important distinction in the mind of parents and also the policymakers in that school district and how they came to this conclusion.
And I'm glad you used the term policymakers, because as a lawyer, when I think about that issue, Tom, the thought that occurs to me is I'd like to see a very straightforward, heartfelt, honest letter from a superintendent and the board to all of those parents, irrespective of whether they enroll in the school or they choose distance or learning, to say, we're doing the best we can. These are the steps we're taking. But we're convinced, because all experts are advising us, that we cannot absolutely safeguard your student. And so you need to know that if you do enroll in the school, notwithstanding our best efforts, there could be a downside. And that's important for us as educators and school board members to communicate that to the parents of our school district. That kind of honesty, and that backed up with the kind of effort that we were talking about earlier in the presentation, I think would be meaningful in a courtroom situation later on if there were an outbreak at a particular school. As self-serving as it sounds, I think that that's important to provide that kind of reality information to parents that are going to enroll their students in public school under current circumstances.
Yeah, that is a, wow. You're right. That would be very heartfelt and really spark conversation. It's a tough one, because at the same time, many parents do need to get back to work, and public school is where their child spends a large part of their day. So. All right, Tom, any more questions, or are we going to let Addison go?
I think we'll let Addison go. Julie, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Addison. Well, and in closing here, a big thank to all our panelists. We had Fred, Jennifer, Lois, Jim, Letty, and of course, Addison. And as always, thank you, Tom. And big thanks to Samantha Campbell, our whiz behind our Zoominars here. But if you thought it was over for the week, wait. Tomorrow, you've got one more, and that's our part 2 of bonds, bond refinancing, certificates of participation, leases, and funding alternatives for the pandemic. Just what we always want to know, where our cash is going to be. We'll have our favorite pollsters on from FM3 to discuss voters, employees, students, parents, surveying them. In addition, we're going to discuss short-term bond solutions, capital funds, and more on federal disaster assistance. Just discussing how our districts will bridge their money gap as we're all experiencing. The next week, we have our CASH statewide school facilities monthly meeting, and that's on Wednesday, June 24th. And that will have updates from our state representatives and legislation that's going on and what's happening at the CASH annual conference. Then Thursday, a week from today, June 25th, the CASH webinar will be the school social distancing logistics. And that's kind of what Tom was alluding to. We're going to offer ideas and plans of school district leaders and architects as they approach the opening of our K-12 campuses. Things are definitely going to be a little different with our webinars starting in July. We will go back to a shorter format of 1 hour and 15 minutes. And that's kind of, as we know, so many of our school district folks and our contractors and architects, we're getting that last push in July to get ready to open up in, at least for us, in August, many other districts too. So after the June 25th, we're going to have a week where we're dark, and then we'll come back on July 9th. And one of the other changes on that is that right now our webinars have been open to anyone who would like to join, but we are going to now close those to cash members for viewing and receiving materials. So if you're not a cash member right now, it's a great time to take an opportunity to visit our cash website and join so that you can keep getting information on our webinars and our materials involving the COVID pandemic. So Cash, myself, and all of our presenters on the webinar today extend our best wishes for continued good health to you and all of your family members. Gratitude and thanks to all our essential workers and frontline heroes out there. As we leave you today, remember the Cash organization is here to help and be a resource to all of you, and we'll keep you informed through emails, webinars as the COVID-19 world evolves. It's also so important that we, as we've talked about today, in the school construction industry, share vital information with each other. I encourage you to reach out to your neighboring districts, your local associate members, your county offices of education, and the Cash staff with any challenges you're facing. Our organization and network may be able to find the right solution for you, and we're all here to help each other. So please take full advantage of this great opportunity and working with the Cash organization. So thank you, and we will see you all next week, probably starting Wednesday, and maybe tomorrow. Anyway, take care.